Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Alicia Farrell. I'm a cognitive psychologist in private practice in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And we've gathered here tonight to talk about a very important topic related to parenting and how to parent around unhealthy substances in this crazy mixed up world that we're raising our children in. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I want to let all of you know that in addition to being a psychologist, I'm also a mother and have raised a son with my husband. He's 29 now. So and we were kind of on the cusp of a lot of the madness that's been going on in our world for the last 10, 15 years. So I have had quite a bit of experience in that way as well as professionally. I also speak professionally all over Connecticut and do a lot of keynote speaking. So I get to learn from all of you as well. And I want to encourage everybody, if while I'm presenting, you'd like to ask a question or you'd like to make a comment, I don't have any problem with being interrupted. We're also going to have a question and answer period at the end of the evening. And what we'll do is we'll turn the recording off at that point so that you guys can talk privately and we can play around with ideas and share experiences. So I also have quite a few handouts, and I will provide those to John, and he will distribute those and make them available to all of you who came tonight, as well as to the community. So I'm really excited to be here tonight and to talk to you about drugs and alcohol. And I'm also going to throw technology into that list as well, because we know that technology is addicting and that our children are getting dependent upon it at very early ages. So when we're talking tonight about this concept of addiction and the prevention of addiction, we're also talking about the use of technology with our children, for our children, and for us as well. So one of the reasons that I love this talk is because no one really wants to have it. And it's tough, right? It's like talking to our kids about sex. We know it has to happen. We know we need to have the conversation. We really hope that someone else would do it for us. And if we do it, we kind of want to do it once and we want it to be done. We had a forum many years ago here in Old Saybrook, and we were talking to the kids about education around drugs and alcohol and what their pearls of wisdom were. And one of the things they said to us was that you can't just do DARE and take us through DARE when we're in middle school and think that we know everything we need to know and we're going to make the right choices. You have to keep talking to us about these issues starting at really young ages. And they were talking about anything and everything related to sex, to drugs, to alcohol, to technology, to anything that is going to be meaningful and powerful in their lives. So anyway, this gets me jazzed because there's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of room for us to do a better job. And it's actually not rocket science. So it's accessible to all of us as well to do a better job in our parenting around unhealthy substances. So my overall goal tonight is for you guys to walk away with three things. The first is I want you to walk away feeling motivated to jump into many ongoing and age-appropriate conversations with your kids about drugs and alcohol and technology. And I want you to feel confident around why you're doing it. The why is really important because that's going to help motivate you, and how to do it. And then finally, I want you to have set realistic expectations around this topic for both yourself and for your children. So those are my overall goals tonight. In the midst of meeting that goal, we're going to cover prevention. We're going to talk about adolescent brain development and how that influences the kinds of conversations that we'll eventually have with our adolescents, and also how to parent for maximum influence. We're not the all-powerful. You'll probably hear me say that again in the talk tonight, but we do have quite a bit of influence. So this can be a very difficult topic to discuss, and it's one that's laden with politics and personal values and socioeconomic issues and judgments and all kinds of really, messy stuff. But tonight we're going to stay out of all of that, and instead we're going to focus on the facts. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. So, how you choose to parent around these issues being drugs and alcohol and technology, is a very personal and private. And I'm not trying to influence you to take a particular stand on any of it. Instead, my goal is to give you the facts from all perspectives so that you can make those decisions for yourself. So, we all want to prevent our kids from becoming dependent on a substance. I think that's something we can all agree on. And we also want to prevent them from doing something risky or dangerous while experimenting or ending up hurting themselves in some way that could affect the quality of the rest of their lives. But here's the thing: what is prevention exactly, and why is it important? So, we're going to actually start with a common metaphor that's used to describe prevention, and it's called the upstream downstream metaphor. And I'm going to read that to you right now. So, on a beautiful fall day at a dangerous river, several people were found downstream and unresponsive. Rescue workers struggle to pull the victims from the water. Some can be resuscitated, but no matter how hard they try, some cannot. Later, back at headquarters, those in charge get together and they discuss how they can afford to have more rangers in the park trained in CPR so victims don't have to wait for emergency responders and instead can get life saving treatment quickly. They make that change and they reevaluate 3 months later and discover that sure enough, more people are being saved. However, they're troubled by the fact that the number of those who have fallen or jumped in the river over the last 3 months has actually gone up. After much deliberation, they decide to look upstream to figure out why people are ending up in this dangerous river in the first place. They realize that not only do they need to treat victims, but they also need to prevent accidents from happening in the first place by addressing the issues that are causing people to end up in the river in the first place. Okay? So, upstream, downstream. I've experienced working both upstream and downstream with families in my practice, and I can tell you that there are no guarantees that working upstream is going to prevent drug and alcohol use or abuse. It does tip the scales in your favor, and since we're talking about a quality of life issue, and in some cases, life and death, it's well worth the effort to work upstream with your children. And as a parent, you want to focus upstream starting at very early ages, as early as third grade. That is not too early. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have specific conversations with your kids about drugs and alcohol at that age. However, it might be age appropriate depending on your child. But there are ways that you can learn to talk to your kids at those younger ages that set the stage. All right. So, if you're on this webinar and you already are downstream with a loved one, I strongly encourage you to get professional help. It's very complicated when you're already downstream, and it's very, very easy because of how much you love your children to actually make some pretty significant mistakes that could create an even worse situation for your children. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what prevention actually looks like as a parent. What do you actually do, and how do you actually do it? So it's more multifaceted than you might think. So listen to this part very carefully. The most obvious goal when we talk about prevention of anything is to stop something from ever happening. That's the way that we look at prevention. So, for example, ensure, like guarantee, that a child who's at risk for mental illness does not smoke marijuana. If you have alcoholism in your family, to make sure your child never takes a drink. Now, here's the rub, here's the truth. Living up to this definition or this goal of prevention is unrealistic. So we have to be careful about how we define this for ourselves as parents. Rarely do we have that much control over variables at any given time that actually stop something from happening. Okay. So never is that more accurate than in relation to our kids' use of and abuse of substances. So I remember when I was a parent of my son when he was young, and how idealistic I was around this myself. So I thought I could control the choices my child made and stop them from making choices that would bring them harm or suffering. Now, that was naive of me, and potentially persisting with that belief system as my son matured would require me to become over controlling and authoritarian in the way that I parented. And we're going to talk about different parenting styles. Authoritarian style being more dictatorial. So, in order to try to prevent something from happening, when you're trying to control another individual, your tendency is going to be to become authoritarian in that relationship. And guess what? That approach could have ended up putting my son in greater risk for use and abuse of substances, not less. So it's important as parents that we adjust our goals and our expectations around prevention to something that's realistic and attainable. So we want to go from thinking my child will never use or abuse drugs to I do not have full and unilateral control over my child's choices. I will do the best I can to educate and connect and respect and mentor my child so that they grow up with confidence and self respect and compassion and grit and resilience. This is the best way to stack the deck in your favor of your child making healthier and informed decisions. All right, so the point I'm making there, it's not just about educating your children about drugs and alcohol. It's about mentoring and parenting your children in a way where they have a sense of self. They have a sense of independence. They have a confidence that they're building over the course of their childhood, and they have some self respect as well. That is going to, in a sense, help them make better choices for themselves, even in the face of what's going on in their brains or what's going on in their families or at school or in this world that they're desperately trying to understand and deal with. So the bottom line is that our power as a parent is in the trying to prevent, not the success. Okay, so we want to try to establish an environment for our children and a structure in our relationships with our kids that's going to stack the deck in our favor, understanding that we don't have full control, and we can't predicate our whether or not we've done our job based on whether or not we were successful with our children. So, if our goal is not to completely stop the use and abuse of alcohol or drugs because we recognize that that can't happen, then our goal becomes trying to stop the use and abuse of drugs and alcohol. All right. So, this is how you do it. And I'm going to lay out the big picture view first, and then we're going to drill it down to more of the boots of the ground and practical suggestions. So there's four things the big picture view touches on. The first is that as a parent, you want to identify variables that put your child at risk for possible dangerous experimentation and dependence. And I'll talk to you more in a moment. I'm going to go over these four, and then we're going to go back and we're going to flesh them out. So identifying those variables and characteristics that put your child potentially at risk for possible experimentation and dependence. The second one is to create strategies and solve problems and parent with these risk factors in mind. The third is to try desperately to help your children delay the use and or abuse of drugs and alcohol and technology as long as possible. And then the fourth is to catch dangerous experimentation early on. Okay, so those are the four. Now we're going to go back and we're going to flesh those out a little bit. So, first of all, identifying the variables that put our children at risk. So, for example, what kinds of things put our children at risk for making these risky decisions that could lead to a dependence on a substance? So, specific situations and experiences and circumstances that put a child at risk include these things. One is their natural temperament, and temperament is genetic. Another is trauma. So, having had a traumatic experience, we all have trauma in our lives. We will all experience trauma and multiple traumas, most likely. And childhood is fraught with that because we don't have a lot of control as a child. Does not mean that your child has experienced trauma, but it's not unusual. And it's important to understand the possible influences of that. The home life, like what is the structure at home? What is the parenting style? How is there stability? How's the relationship between the mother and the father and the siblings, and if there are siblings? Whether or not that child has ADHD, whether or not that child has anxiety or depression, the friend group that child is in, and their experience within that friend group. Feeling like an outsider can often put a child at risk for doing things that they would not normally do in order to be a part of a group. Family history of use and abuse. Adolescence itself, actually, just being an adolescent, and we're going to talk about brain development and why that is that adolescents are at greater risk. Too much time on social media. I can't say enough about this. And we'll talk more about it as well. But I just strongly encourage all of you to delay giving your child a phone for as long as possible. And if they have a phone, they should not have access to the world in that phone, if at all humanly possible. These kids' interaction with social media is causing some very interesting changes in their development, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Um, okay, and then in the face of those variables, developing and implementing strategies and interventions with respect to these risk factors. So temperament. Now we're going to just kind of talk a little bit more about each one of those possible variables that could influence our children's choices. So take the time to know your children's temperament. And the best way to get to know your children's temperament is to spend time with them. Spend time with them when they're stressed. Spend time with them when they're enjoying themselves, and not just time where you're running from one activity to another activity, but real time observing them, being with them, interacting with them, getting to know them. I'll say this again a little bit later. Your role as a parent is not to create a human being in your image. It's not to create the human being that you think your child needs to be in order to be successful in the world, whatever that means, in order to be happy in the world, whatever that means. Your job is actually to get to know your child. They are actually independent of you. They are dependent on you until they grow up, but they are independent beings from you. And it's not healthy for you to parent from a place where you feel like you have to create a human being that is a certain way or does certain things. All right. So that's getting to know your child. So look for things like, how does your child handle change? How does your child handle stress? Are they just by nature more introverted or more extroverted? Do they worry a lot? Are they worriers by nature? Do they take risks easily? Do you have a child that's a risk taker and they're the ones flying off the top of the couch, and then you have another child that's not and it's more introverted and they're on the floor watching the other child with their eyes large going, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing that." Are they highly sensitive? So, are they sensitive, and are they maybe highly sensitive? So here's something very, very interesting. Some individuals, and it's somewhere in between, we're seeing like 12 to 20% of people are what we call highly sensitive. people. And there's a book called The Highly Sensitive Person. If you think your child might fit into this category, I strongly encourage you to get that book, or you think that maybe you fit into that category. So highly sensitive individuals are different. They're made differently. Their nervous systems are made differently, and not in a. It doesn't have to be in a bad way. They just have these superpowers in a sense to experience the energy in the world, in the room, within their own bodies. So they may even have more acute hearing or more acute smell, taste. Their eyesight might be more acute. And what happens with highly sensitive individuals is that they get overstimulated very easily, and they really need to take care of themselves in a different way than other people may need to. Those individuals may be at greater risk for finding a drug that, chills them out, like weed. And all of a sudden, they feel like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like life is so hard right now. I'm not feeling so overwhelmed and agitated all the time. I can handle things better. This is perfect. And I'm going to use this drug to sleep, and I'm going to use this drug to chill out. And then over time, they're at risk for becoming dependent on that. And I will mention to you right now that weed, although it may initially cause you to feel chilled out, if you use it enough and over a long enough length of time, it can be an anxiogenic, which means it can actually cause you to start experiencing anxiety. So I want to throw that in for you. Are your children by nature or through the pressure that they're experiencing a perfectionist? So I want to define perfectionism for you. Perfectionism is not having to do everything perfectly, having to have everything perfect. It's actually a belief system. And the belief system is that if I don't perform perfectly, then I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of love and affection. I'm not worthy of respect. I'm not good enough. So we're raising our children in a culture of perfectionism, and the kids will tell you flat out that they feel the pressure, and they feel as if they everybody outside of them wants them, needs them to be perfect. And having that mindset sets an individual up for not feeling good enough because it's irrational. It's actually considered a thought trap. Thought traps encourage us to believe things that aren't true. And in doing that, our stress goes up, our anxiety goes up. And then what do? We pull away because we're uncomfortable instead of pushing ahead. So when you're feeling like that, you're obviously looking for something that's going to help you feel better. It's going to give you a break from how uncomfortable it is to just exist in this world with all the expectations. So you want, and I want to talk about parenting style, and your parenting style is going to help with this. Um, it's challenging because the kids are getting this message not just from you as parents but also from a lot of other places. So I get a lot of parents will say, well, gosh, I don't pressure my kid to get straight A's, and yet they're coming home and they're racked with stress and anxiety around their performance. So I understand and appreciate the fact that, again, you're not the all powerful here. And then, are your children easily influenced by other individuals? Do you have a child that's just naive and kind of gullible by nature, by temperament, and has a hard time? Maybe they're pleasers, and maybe they come by that naturally, or maybe they've learned that being codependent that way is the way to create connection, and that could put them at risk. Okay. So you might develop a sense for whether your children may be at greater risk for use and abuse of substances, but that won't necessarily answer the question of whether or not they're at risk. So don't be fooled. You could be wrong either way. And and that's just the nature of life. There's no black and white here. But what I want you to know is you're at a much better chance of recognizing the risks that might be coming your way with your children by taking the time to get to know them and to understand them understand them if you can better than they understand themselves when they're younger, so that you can help support them and guide them and mentor them. And then when they're out and they're at a time in their lives where they're making a lot of really important decisions, hopefully that will mean that they will feel more comfortable coming to you, and they'll also be better armed to know when they're in over their head, or to be able to make decisions based on not the pressures that they're feeling, but instead what's right for them. Okay, so once again, your role as a parent is not to create a person that you feel your child needs to be. It's to get to know that person and let them be separate from you. Let them be an individual. So, okay. So, another possible risk factor is trauma. And we could, I mean, not all of us experienced trauma around COVID, but I will say that the COVID experience fits the definition of trauma perfectly. And the definition of trauma is that you're in a situation where you don't have control over what's happening to you, and you are getting fight or flight responses and you cannot act on them. So if you look at COVID, it was sort of trauma in a bottle, because it wasn't just one experience, it was chronic. So a lot of us, and you included, are healing from this right now. And trauma is actually, you have the memory, whatever the traumatic experience might have been, but the trauma itself is energy. It's energy that gets stored in your nervous system and you carry it around with you, and it kind of comes out sideways. It gets triggered and comes out sideways. And it also means that your nervous system is elevated. Your baseline is higher. Let me say it that way. Your baseline is higher, higher level of agitation on a regular basis than it would be otherwise. So before, you, yes, can you heal from trauma? Absolutely, you can heal from trauma. Some trauma is significant enough to, instead of really healing from it, you learn to desensitize to it and you learn to regulate around it. And then other times you're able to actually completely heal from it and get rid of that energy enough so that it doesn't have any influence on the way that you think, the way you feel, and the choices that you make in your life. So, so, but here's the thing: trauma can create a chronic state of discomfort that may cause individuals to want to self-medicate, and we saw this going on during COVID. A lot of individuals who were in recovery, um, they relapsed, and a lot of individuals who didn't have a dependence on a substance created a dependence on a substance, or indulged beyond what they should for a period of time in an attempt to really take care of themselves and escape that feeling of discomfort. Okay, so trauma. Home life. So things like, if you have an unstable marriage and you think you're hiding that from your kids, I'll tell you now, your kids know. They may not know how to talk about it, they may not know how to label it, or even understand how it's affecting them, but they know. They know that something isn't right in the household. And the older your child gets, the more they will begin to understand that it's related to the relationship that you have. Get some help, if that's the case, because you are affecting your children, and because you're affecting the environment within which they're being raised and the structure of that environment. So, so get some help and do some work and see if you can't improve the connection between you and your significant other. Divorce can put a child at risk for making risky decisions, and I think for obvious reasons. It's difficult. It's can be traumatic. It's challenging, and they don't have any control over it. So it can influence them in significant ways. Not to say that you shouldn't get a divorce if that's what you decide you need to do to improve the environment for your child and to improve your own life as well. Things like chronic illness, financial stress in the family, physical or emotional abuse, volatility and anger, parenting style, which we'll go into detail about in a moment, your own parents' mental health. So if you happen to be going through a period of depression and it's chronic and it's clinical, you want to get some help for that, because even though you may think you're functioning and you're getting by, you're influencing the environment in the home, and that's going to have an influence on your children. You're interacting with your children differently than you would if you were not feeling depressed. The same with anxiety. If you discover that you're not just experiencing a stressful time in your life, but you're actually struggling with heightened anxiety that seems to influence the quality of your life, so it may actually be considered an anxiety disorder, get some help around that. That can come out in the way that you parent, and you can unwittingly pass that anxiety on to your children. So, say you're anxious about your child having a sleepover or their first sleepover, and and you may have heard me talk about this as an example, but you're the anxious parent, and so you're saying, okay, we're going to do this ahead of time. We're going to get your bag packed. We're going to have it out by the door a week ahead of time. I'm going to take you, honey, to the sleepover. I'm going in with you. I'd never just drop you off, and I'll stay until you give me the thumbs up, and then I'll leave and I'll wait in the car for a while. You got the phone, call me anytime, middle of the night, I'll come get you. And by the time you get done telling the child all about the sleepover, they're thinking, holy cow, I maybe I don't want to go to this sleepover. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. These things sound really dangerous. In fact, they could be life threatening. So you have unwittingly passed your anxiety onto your child, and now they're seeing the situation that way, and they most likely will give you a call and you're going to have to come get them, and that is exactly what you shouldn't do in that situation. You should let them work through the discomfort, but you're not going to be able to do that unless you're able to regulate around your own anxiety. Okay. um, and then finally, let's see, mental family history. So it's very rare for a family not to have some history of substance use or abuse. And the thoughts are, and I don't, I hear it a million different ways. So I have to come to the conclusion that we don't know for sure, but I think this is pretty reasonable, and that is that the risks for dependence are thought to be about 50% genetic. And that means that 50% of the likelihood of developing a dependence on a substance is actually modifiable. That's really exciting. So that means that you can choose your way out and choose your way through times in your life where you might be at risk. And and we want our children to know that they can do that for themselves in childhood as well as in adulthood, that they have the power of choice no matter what. That can never be taken away from a child or from an adult. So remember that for yourselves as well. I get a little frustrated with my parents in relation to technology and their use of technology, and the way that they allow their children to interact with technology. The reason I get frustrated is that we as a culture are acting like we don't have control. Like we can't put this device down. We can't decide not to interact with it. And that's because we have a dependence on it. We have an addiction to it. And I will say that I call my phone a rectangle because I don't like to give it a lot of respect. I try to see it as a tool and not a lifestyle. And I'm just as susceptible as everyone else is to becoming dependent and addicted to it. And I've got to watch myself very carefully. I'll get into bed, I'll get on my iPad, I'll say, "Oh, I'm just gonna look at the news before I read my book, because I know reading is so much healthier, but I'm just going to look at the news real quick." And I start to flick through the news, and then I start reading about the Kardashians, and then I see that there's something about the new spring styles, and then I go there, and pretty soon I look at my watch and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for 45 minutes and it's 10:30 and I really wanted to be reading instead. We're all susceptible to it because we are built to become dependent on things. And the point being that even though we're built that way, and even though it's really hard not to get dependent on our device, we can. All we have to do is choose out of it. So if you find yourself spending 45 minutes one night, then the next night, don't do it. Put it down and teach our children that they have the ability to do the same thing. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit. Let me just check my time, see how I'm doing here. Okay, good. Let's talk just a little bit about adolescent brain development because it is a very special time in our children's development. So when our children reach adolescence, they're not children anymore. We call it adolescence because it's just a different developmental period. And yes, it's challenging, and you'll understand more about that when we talk about the brain. It's also just such an amazing time in our lives, and as parents, an amazing time for us to connect with our kids as they are pulling away from us. Now, when I say connect with them, I don't mean connect to them, hold on to them, and desperately try to navigate their adolescence for them to keep them safe. That's not what I mean. What I mean by connection is starting to understand that it's time for them, even before this, to start letting go and but maintaining control over our authority as a parent in order to keep them safe when we need to, and otherwise letting them work things out and being collaborative with them along the way. So let's talk a little bit about the adolescent brain. So there's a puzzling contradiction during adolescence. It's actually close to the lifelong peak in physical health and strength and mental capacity to learn. So these little rascals, right? Going through this difficult time in their lives, and difficult for us in some respects, and they're actually peaking in some ways as well. They don't appreciate that. We see that that might be the case, and in desire for that for ourselves because we're beyond that stage in our lives. Um, but anyway, so even though they're reaching the peak in some respects along those lines, it's also a very sensitive time of brain development and self-discovery and socio-emotional development. So there is a lot happening. Adolescents do not think like adults. They do not think like adults. So remember something very important. Early human brain development changes in response to experience. And it's a sensitive time for permanent changes, both positive and negative, to occur in the brain structure and the brain function of our kids. That is one of the motivations to step into parenting in a way that stacks the deck in the favor of them not abusing substances, unhealthy substances, and technology as well. So, interestingly, there, let me just see, make sure I've got this, how I've got this laid out. Okay, so when we're prepubescent, right around 12, 13 years old, something really interesting happens in our brains. We get this, what we call proliferation, and it's a period of time where the brain produces new brain cells and synapses, which are just connections between nerve cells in the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. This also happens one other time right before the child is born. And the purpose of this is for the brain to kind of maximize the number of brain cells there are. And then over time, what happens is those brain cells start to die off. And that sounds kind of like, oh my God, that's terrible. Well, no, it's actually really important. It's called pruning. And pruning happens after birth as well. And it happens again after that period of proliferation in the prepubescent years. So the brain cells that end up surviving are the brain cells that are being used, the ones that are forming connections with one another. So, depending on what you're doing with your brain is hard coding itself in some respects. Now, the brain is also very, we call it plastic, which means that it can recover from a lot of things over the course of our entire lives. We can grow new brain cells, we can repair brain cells through how we, through nutrition, through how we take care of ourselves, through exercise, through all kinds of really interesting things. Um, but there is a period of time in adolescence where the brain is that there's a thickening of the gray matter in the brain due to that cell production, as well as what we call myelination, which is really an integration. And the myelination is a fatty substance that forms over the axons in the nerve cells that allows for the transmission of information. So there's some really important stuff going on. So this is happening in adolescence, primarily in the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex has a very important role. Not only is its purpose to allow an individual to solve complex problems, make decisions, to plan, to store information in memory, to pay attention, to execute tasks. It allows us to consider the risk and benefits of the things that we're considering doing or that we're doing, and it allows impulse control. So there, what it does is it connects with the midbrain, which is where the emotional center of the brain is, and in connecting to that, the prefrontal cortex is able to better regulate though that desire to engage in risky behavior or be impulsive in the decision making. Now, in adolescence, those regulatory fibers are forming. They are not fully formed, and they won't be fully formed, we believe, until for boys until about 25, maybe longer, and for girls around 22, again, maybe longer. We're not exactly sure. So, what these regulatory fibers do is they slow down decision making, um, and they develop over time. The other thing that's going on in the adolescent brain is there's an increase of activity of the nerve circuits, the neuronal circuits that utilize dopamine in the brain, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter. So, in response to that overactivity, the brain, the adolescent brain, when it's doing something that feels really good, it feels really good because they're getting a burst of dopamine. So, their baseline level of dopamine tends to be lower than average when they're at a resting rate, just hanging out on the couch. And you see that with adolescents. They look like they're despondent. They're hanging around, and all of a sudden their friends walk in and they're going to go do something really fun with them. And they perk up and they look happy and they come home all jazzed. Well, that's because that reward system in the brain is much more active in adolescence. So when they do something that feels good, it feels really good because they're getting this very high level of dopamine, bursts of dopamine that throw them well over the average level in their brain, particularly in their prefrontal cortex. So their brain is very sensitive to creating dependence because of its natural system for releasing high levels of dopamine. So what does that mean? It means that if something feels really good in adolescence, you want to do more of it. If it actually reduces your discomfort in the process of feeling really good, you're going to want to do more of it, and your brain is going to try to convince you that that's a good thing, that that is what you should be doing. Okay, so it leads to impulsivity, to increased susceptibility for addiction, for hyper rationality. You see that with your adolescents. You get into a conversation with them and it's a circular conversation and they become kind of hyper rational, very black and white, won't see the grays, that circular reasoning. And they think in very literal and concrete terms. They tend to look at facts, not the big picture. So they're not good at what we call gist thinking. So they consider the gist thinking is when you can consider the larger context of your decisions and use intuition to guide your decision making. And they're just not there yet. Those skills are forming in adolescence. So here's what's challenging about that. You can sit down with your teenager and you could have a conversation. They're going out to a party and you could say, hey, these are my expectations. This is what I don't want you, please don't be influenced to try anything. If you get into trouble or you feel like you're getting pressured, feel free to call me. You say all the right things, right? And the child, your adolescence is sitting there listening to you and saying, got it. Yeah, okay. Of course, mom. I would never do that. And they are telling you that from their heart. They're believing it. They're like, of course I would never do that. That would never be something that I'd be stupid to do that. And they believe it. They believe that that's the case. Then they get to the party and something happens, something changes. And what changes is that they start to interact with their peers, and they start to get influenced, or they start to experience something that feels good, or they start to experience some fear and stress around socializing. And then somebody offers them something, or they get themselves into trouble in another way, and they can't even tell you why they did it after the fact. They'll say, "I don't know what happened. I don't even remember making the decision." And you as a parent are like, "Oh, right. Come on. What are you telling me? That's ridiculous. Of course you made the decision." And yeah, they did make the decision, but the truth is that it was impulsive. Maybe they weren't even aware that they had lost control of the situation for themselves, and they made a really poor decision that they had said 2 hours ago they would never even consider making. And they did it. And sometimes they feel terrible and can't even understand it themselves. That's a perfect example of how that adolescent brain is taking over and guiding decisions. So, having said that, most teens survive, and we do as well. And adolescents can make rational decisions and know the difference between right and wrong. Okay, so that is possible for them. So the fact that their brain is still developing and everything I just said doesn't mean that that we need to then react to them as if they don't have responsibility. They can't be held responsible because of where they are in their brain development. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we do need to learn how to communicate with our children during this time in a way that facilitates more chances. They need chances, and they need opportunity to connect with you without judgment. Okay. So, um, when they're confronted with stressful or emotional decisions, they're more likely to act impulsively on instinct, irrationally, without fully understanding or analyzing the consequences of their actions. So that's why they need second, third, and sometimes four chances. And I trust me, I understand what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Alicia, that's not the world we live in anymore. Used to be like when my husband was growing up here in Old Saybrook, he'd get pulled over with his buddies. They'd be in the car. They'd have a case of beer. They might even be drinking some beer. This was back in the 70s. And the cops would literally say, okay, I'll follow you home, or we'll drive you home, park the car. They would do things like that. Nowadays, that's not the case. So I understand that that we also need to be very well aware of the world that our children are growing up in, and there are some things that can have immediate and serious deleterious effects on the opportunities that they'll get in the future. But here's the magic of all of this. If you start early with your children, really early, like after they're born, allowing them to make mistakes, allowing them to have a second chance and a third chance around things that are not as serious and scary as substances, you will, in the process of parenting that way, create a child who's thought through a lot of things for themselves, who understands the connection between choices and consequences. And it doesn't mean, again, that it's going to be perfect and that's going to prevent them from getting into trouble, but it is definitely going to stack the deck. So, what does that mean? That means that you start letting go of your children when you get pregnant. And what I mean by that is there are things that you have already, at the point of getting pregnant, you've already lost control of. You've lost control of your child's temperament, their height, their hair color, whether it's straight or curly. their eye color, what they're going to look like, all kinds of things have already been decided. So if we have that mindset from the beginning, and I'm going to give you a suggestion on how you can actually let go from that place and without losing control, you're going to do a much better job of raising children that will be able to independently respect themselves and make healthier decisions for themselves. Okay. So ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to delay something from happening until your child is old enough to make healthier choices for themselves and better informed decisions. So in relation to substances, we know that if you can help your child get to 21 without an addiction, there is over a 90% chance that they will not have one. So and we made it with my son, and it's so sort of counterintuitive because it's 21st birthday, they go out and they get drunk, most of them, with their friends. So they're celebrating the fact that now they can legally party, and if they don't have an addiction, we're celebrating the fact that they don't have an addiction, and hopefully they're going to get a ride home, not drive, and they don't party like that frequently. So you want to think about parenting in a way that helps delay their use and abuse as long as possible. So parents have the greatest influence over whether or not their children use or abuse drugs. They do not have the all-powerful influence. This is not to say that you are the all-powerful, and I want to give you an example of this. So Dr. Laura Berman, who's actually a New York Times bestselling author, she's a sex therapist and has her own show on Oprah's own channel. She lost her 16-year-old son. This was, I think it was during COVID, so maybe it was a year and a half ago. 16-year-old son, he went on Snapchat, he ordered some Xanax, he had it delivered to the house. And it turns out it was laced with fentanyl, and he overdosed and died. 16 years old. And this is what she said. She said, we watched him so closely. He was a straight A student. He was getting ready for college. And this was a situation where it was experimentation gone bad, right? So here was a family who, for all intent and purposes, based on their self-report, were raising this young man, and the young man was a fine young man, and it was the last thing that anybody thought that young man would ever do, including that young man, by the way. And what a tragedy. So we can do everything in the best way we possibly can, and our children can still make poor decisions and get themselves in trouble and harm themselves. So we have to accept that. So in the interest of that, don't minimize three things. First of all, the behavior that you model for your children and how your kids learn from it. So if you have a substance use issue yourself, you want to take a close look at that, because you're modeling behavior and you're a powerful person in your children's life. And that is influencing their perspective on how to function in life, how to deal with stress and anxiety, how to feel good in ways that don't require a lot of work, and how to numb your feelings so that you don't have to experience the discomfort of being an emotional being. And we are emotional beings over logical beings, and it's very uncomfortable and messy at times. So look at what you're doing yourself and change that if you feel like it's influencing your children in a deleterious way. The second thing that I want you to not minimize is the influence that your relationship, your connection with your child has on their choices. So if you have a secure, healthy attachment with your child, you respect them, they learn to respect you. Nothing is perfect. You still can yell at your kid and lose your shit. They can yell at you and you say the F word and, all these things that happen within our families. It's all normal. Okay. We're not talking about perfection for anybody. You don't have to be the perfect parent. They don't have to be the perfect child. You don't have to have the perfect environment. So, but you do want to recognize that there's an influence, that the quality of your relationship with your child can very well have an influence on their development and the choices that they make. And then finally, number three is don't minimize the power of technology and social media to parent your child. So one of the things that we're seeing is that social media is becoming one of the most competitive aspects towards our ability to parent our own kids. So our kids are going to social media to ask questions that they would normally come and ask their family. They're getting answers from individuals that they would normally get answers from people that they knew, that were central parts of their lives, that they respected, that they felt safe with. And technology and social media does not have the best interest of your children in mind. What we're seeing happen with our kids right now is something called age compression. And age compression is a result of exposure to developmentally inappropriate information on social media and having to face difficult social situations that would not normally happen to them until they were older. So what's happening is we're seeing our kids younger and younger acting older and older. So you have a child who's 10 years old, 11 years old, and they're acting like a full-blown adolescent. They're acting, pushing you away and telling you that they're ready to do things they're clearly not ready to do in any way, shape, or form. They're not listening to you. They're not respecting you. They want you to leave them alone, let them make their own decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's creating a very difficult parenting environment for us, this age compression, because you have a child, right? They're not adolescents yet. Their brain hasn't even started the process of adolescence, but they're acting like that way because it's being modeled on what they're looking at, through what they're looking at. And so we we're faced with a conundrum as we are parenting children that are acting older, trying to then parent them in a way to address the behavior. But how do you do that without treating them like they're older than they are? So that's another really good reason to delay our kids' exposure as much as possible. So okay, let's talk about, let me just check the time. We started a little late. We're still doing good. Okay, so let's talk about creating something that is going to help this whole process, and it's called a positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop is when you promote positive behavior that supports better choices and mitigates the risks associated with different stages of our children's development. So here's what a positive feedback loop is. It is doing things, and we pay attention to this for yourselves as well. It's doing things that we enjoy and that are good for us, that lead to feelings of happiness and joy and love and contentment, which leads to us wanting to do more good things for ourselves. And these positive emotions help us develop our physical, psychological, and social resources, which lead to more positive emotions. So when you have a nice, strong, positive feedback loop in your life, you're more resilient. You have more grit. When you face adversity and it's uncomfortable, it's not as uncomfortable because you have a counterbalance to the challenges in your life. This takes effort. It takes effort to create and it takes effort to feed. You need to feed it. It needs energy. And so you need to bring the energy, the experiences to your positive feedback loop. A few things we know are really important to have in that loop, and that is connection, social interaction, connection with family, connection with friends, connection with community, connection with school, um, connection with activities and things that we like to do that feel good to us, that we're good at, for example, or that we're trying to get better at. Those are the kinds of things that you want to be paying attention to have in that positive feedback loop. So it's called building a life that speaks to us. And I like to call it running your own race. And we want to teach our children to run their own race because that is a really awesome place to know yourself well enough. And we get to know ourselves endlessly throughout our entire lives. So we're talking about any moment in time in the course of our lives. We know ourselves to the point where we know what's good for us. We know what feels good to us. We know what our needs are. We know what our wants are. And a child can have that kind of awareness for themselves at very young ages based on where they are in their lives. Like I really want those Nike sneakers. Okay, that's not a need. What do you need? I really need to eat dinner because I didn't eat lunch today. Okay. So being able to identify that, and that is that process of getting to know yourself and you as a parent allowing and helping your child get to know themselves that way so that they can be in charge of their positive feedback loop. Um, so here's an example of the opposite of a positive feedback loop. Your child comes by their athleticism. Say you have a child who's athletic naturally, and it runs in the family. You guys are just, you tend to be athletes. And it's always been really important to you that your child dedicates much time to their athletics and excels at their sports. From that perspective, from their perspective, from the child's perspective, they don't enjoy sports that much, but they're doing it because they feel like they have to meet family expectations, literally to fit in the family and to feel worthy. They've tried to talk to you about how they don't like playing sports and would rather take an art class. And you've told them that playing a sport is required, and so is they're doing their best at it. So not only are they going to do it, but don't get out there and not try your hardest all the time because that's not okay in our family. Is this child at risk for experimentation, dangerous experimentation? Absolutely. Absolutely, that child is at risk because here's what's happening. And I see this in my practice. I'll have families come in and they'll say, "We're a soccer family." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, what does that mean?" The kids play soccer. We played soccer and they play soccer. Yeah, but Junior's saying that Junior doesn't like soccer anymore. Junior wants to stop playing soccer and do something else. I can see why you would want Junior to do something, to have an extracurricular activity. That is very important. But why does he have to play soccer? Because we're a soccer family and he's good at soccer. He's always been good at soccer. And they'll have this conversation with the child in the room, and the child's like, "Yeah, I know. I know. I've been working at soccer my whole life, and now I'm 15 years old, and I don't want to play soccer anymore." "Yeah, but that's going to ruin your chances to play soccer in college." "I don't want to play soccer in college." "Yeah, but how could you not want to play soccer in college? You're so good at it." "I don't care if I'm good at it. I want to do this instead." So you could just hearing that dialogue coming out of my mouth back and forth. What the parents are saying to that child is that I need you to be like this in order to be good enough. And the child is feeling like, well, I don't want that for myself. I want something else. And that must mean I'm not good enough. And a child that feels very deeply like they're not good enough, they're not worthy of love and affection, and they have to earn it from their parents by doing the things their parents want them to do and doing it well, that child is at great risk for addiction. I see it all the time in my practice. Those kids who are getting pushed and driven, and the expectations are high all the time, and they've got no room to wiggle, and they don't have any agency in their own lives. those kids check out. Those kids want to be numb. Okay. So um, I wanted to make sure that you understood the difference between a negative feedback loop and the positive feedback loop. In a positive feedback loop situation, the parents it's hard. They don't want to let go of the fact that their kid's good at soccer, but they don't want to play anymore. But the right thing to do is to have a meaningful conversation with that child and say, okay, I get it. I also want you to understand that you're not going to quit soccer and not do anything other than go to school and come home and play video games. So you're going to need to decide on a couple of activities that you would like to explore and experiment with, or that you would enjoy, and we will add those to your schedule, and you can quit soccer. So when you're ready to have that conversation and talk about some ideas that you have, then let's do that. Until that time, you'll be going to soccer practice. So that way you're setting the child up to need to think for themselves in order to make a change that they desire. And they're going to feel like, okay, I'm given agency here. I need to make some choices for myself. And if they need help with that, they come to you and they talk to you about it. Like, yeah, you know what, I'm struggling. I'm trying to decide, and I've got these ideas, but I'm just not sure, and I don't know how to make the decision. Totally developmentally appropriate. Then you step in, you have a collaborative conversation, you help that child work through their thought process until you guys can come up with a solution. Okay. That is feeding the positive feedback loop. Okay. All right. So you want to develop and maintain a quality relationship with your child. So, as important as it is to have specific conversations about drugs and alcohol and technology, when all is said and done, the best preventative approach is to have a quality relationship. Now, it's more about getting it right, your parenting, most of the time, not all of the time. So your child has grit and they have resilience by nature, and they want to please you. They need opportunity to understand the grit and resilience that they have, and to take ownership over that and learn how to access it and use it to, in a sense, as a tailwind to push them through difficult times rather than a headwind that's going to hold them back, okay, when they're feeling afraid. Remember, even a child that acts like they don't care, they care. And they care very much about what you think about them. They want to please you. So they are also primed to forgive as long as you put your ego aside and are willing to apologize. So, in the process of making some shifts in your parenting after this presentation, if you choose to do that, you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to blow it. And that's okay. That's totally fine. One of your superpowers as a parent to get credibility in your relationship with your child is to circle back around when you make a mistake and apologize. And apologize in a genuine way with no but on the end of it. Like, I'm really sorry, but what you did really sucked. No, apologize. I had several moments, more than several moments, in the upbringing of my son. One I can remember so clearly, and he was a little guy. He was maybe 5 years old, maybe he was in kindergarten, and I was whacked out of my head. I was in graduate school and I was teaching university and running a research lab, and I was tired and overwhelmed. And it was the weekend, and I lost my shit over something that I'm embarrassed even telling the story today, because it literally, my son didn't do anything, nothing, but I lost my shit on him because I thought he did something. And I sent him to his room. I yelled, and I'm not a yeller. I lost it. I just, ugh. And when I calmed down and I realized the mistake I made, I gave myself a timeout. I went in my room. I took out my books. I was like, oh my God, Alicia, what an idiot. And I cried. I had a nice little cry. And then I went into my son's room and I sat on his bed and I said, listen, that was all me, son. That was all me. And I am so sorry. And I feel terrible that I treated you that way. And I broke all my own values. I was disrespectful and hurtful, and I yelled at you. And I'm really sorry. And he's, the kids, oh my God, he was so sweet. He said, "Oh, Mom, it's all right. It's not that big a deal." And I said, "That's fine. You don't have to take care of me, but I appreciate that." And he said, "It's okay." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you. I'm thankful that you feel that way." And it was all over. Your kids, when you apologize, they kind of, inside they're like, "Uh-huh, yeah, that felt good to me," because it's nice for them to see that you are imperfect and that you take responsibility when you blow it. And it also gives them permission to be imperfect and to circle back around and understand that forgiveness is very important. And forgiveness, believe it or not, can also be closely related to choices that we make around substances and around and food and technology and you name it, shopping, anything that we can become dependent upon. Because when we're carrying a lot of guilt or shame or anger, those feelings percolate and they're unresolved. We haven't forgiven somebody or they haven't forgiven us. It puts us at risk for making stupid decisions in our lives. So, teaching your child the importance of forgiveness. So, real quick, I'm just going to go over a few more things and then we're going to stop and we'll open things up for conversation and questions. I just want to touch on some very specific things related to having a quality relationship with your child. So, let me just be clear about the parenting styles, even though I've touched on them a little bit here and there. So, there are actually four styles. One is the authoritarian style we talked about earlier. It's militaristic, it's black and white, it's my way or the highway. I'm going to decide what my expectations are of you, and you are going to do what I tell you to do, and you're going to do it how I tell you to do it, and you're going to do it really well. Not a great style. Sometimes all these styles, we can move in and out of these styles, and it's okay to be authoritarian sometimes. Sometimes you have to be authoritarian to protect your child or to get your child's attention. Sometimes it's necessary. Totally fine to do that. You don't want to use it as your primary parenting style. What often happens with kids that are raised in the authoritarian manner, they get sneaky. And you are not going to catch that kid most likely with dangerous experimentation early on. Because they are used to when they get caught, they get punished and they feel shame. So they're going to sneak around. They're not going to tell you what's going on in their lives, not going to share with you. They're not going to trust you because your tendency is going to be to judge them, be critical of them, shame them, step in and take over in situations. So that is going to put a child at much greater risk for getting themselves into some deep water. Uh, Permissive parenting style, and there are actually two. One is in permissive indifferent, and that's sort of like, you know what, go do whatever you want to do, and I'm busy over here doing what I need to do, and I'll catch up with you at some point. So it is what it sounds like: permissive, indifferent, permissive. Did I say indulgent? I meant indifferent. Permissive, indifferent parenting, and that's scary kind of parenting when that's your style overall, because you're leaving your kid to kind of figure things out on their own all the time. And that creates a child that is at risk for high levels of anxiety and depression and low self-esteem. Your kids do need structure and they do need expectations and they do need support from you and help. And then the other permissive style is permissive indulgent. And this is when you kind of act like you're your kids' friends all the time. And you don't want to upset them. You're afraid to upset your children. You're afraid to be a parent, basically. And so you indulge everything. And my example for that is you have a kid who's been playing video games for the last 10 hours. And instead of going in and pulling out the plug and saying, okay, that's it, this is too much, you need to get outside and play, you go in and you say, hey, can I make you a ham sandwich? Would you like some popcorn so you don't have to get up and stop what you're doing? So this is not healthy. Your child doesn't feel very much like a permissive, indifferent parent. The child doesn't feel support the way they need support. And you think you're being really supportive because you're basically indulging their every desire and their every feeling. So they have those kids have a lot of control over their parents because our kids' superpower with us is emotion. And all a child has to do in a permissive, indulgent relationship with their parents is to get upset, get angry, to dysregulate emotionally, and that parent's like, okay, 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 okay. Well, what do we need to do? Okay, yes, of course, let's go out. I'll get you that. You want ice cream? Okay, good. Let's go do that. Because that parent is excruciatingly uncomfortable with their children's discomfort. That is also going to most likely develop into a child who has a low self esteem. They're afraid to make decisions and take control of their lives, and they're handicapped because they have a very difficult time growing up. And then finally, the piece de resistance, which is the authoritative style of parenting. So listen to that word, authoritative. That means that you have authority, but it is, and sometimes it's black and white, you're in charge. And sometimes, most of the time, it's actually collaborative. And you can start that with children that are really quite young. And it does not mean that everything has to be discussed ad nauseum or figured out together all the time, because that is that's not a good situation either. Your child feels like they get to have a say in everything. That's not what I'm talking about. It sounds like this. Um, let's say your child goes to the party and does some risky things, doesn't get caught, but you find out about it. Doesn't get into trouble, but you find out about it. And let's say you lose your shit first, because that could happen for sure. It happened with me. I know my husband. And then so you recover from that, and now you're going to parent authoritatively. So what you do is you sit down, you start having a conversation with your child. And it's not a conversation where you're the authority and you're telling them, you're dictating to them, you're saying, what the hell happened to you? What's wrong with you? We had that conversation before you went. How could you just go out and make that decision? I want to trust you. And you go on and on and on like that. No, no, it sounds like this. So, sweetheart, that was scary. That was scary that you made the choice that you did. It could have resulted in something really dangerous. And I want to understand how you were feeling in the moment or what was going on for you. And they may say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Chances are they're going to go into that hole. That's okay. That's all right. Let them listen to them. So when they're saying, I don't know what happened, then you can just say to them, well, I can tell that you're feeling a lot right now. I bet you are. I bet looking back on that, that must have been scary for you. So I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but in short order, we need to have a conversation about how you can handle something like that differently and how dad and I can be supportive of you the next time around. So, I mean, do you want to talk about that right now, or do you want some time to kind of think it through? And that the child starts to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm being respected, I'm being heard, and I'm being understood. That is what the authoritative parenting style allows for. And that is at the heart of a quality relationship. Without exception, every teenager that I work with, if you ask them, what do you want from your parents? They will say to me, all I want is for them to hear me and understand and respect me. And they'll say they don't have to agree with me. They don't have to agree with me. I could be wrong, but I still want to feel like they're hearing me and understanding that I'm feeling the way that I am. So when you're communicating with your kids at any age, around any situation, pay attention to how you communicate that to them. You're not going to communicate that to them by being shameful. And shameful sounds like, what the hell is going on with you? You knew you had that chemistry coming up, that chemistry exam, and you knew you had a review sheet you had to get done, and you just didn't do it. And now you're coming here telling me that, it's the teacher's fault? What the hell? There's something wrong with you that you keep doing this. This is over and over and over again, you keep doing this. Now you can imagine if your boss talked to you that way, what it would feel like. Well, it feels really crappy as a child. There's a power imbalance as it is. And so then you're coming at them and over them instead of checking in with them like, wow, I know you're not feeling good about what happened with that exam. Um, and I know that you didn't try as hard as you could. So let's talk about it. Like what's going on? And you try to navigate the conversation with them in a more collaborative way, right? And helping them to solve the problem instead of you solving it for them. So here is the the process of development, skill development and socio-emotional development and cognitive development that you want to engage in with your children at every age. And this is how it works. When they can't do something themselves because they're not ready, you do it for them, right? When they're just starting to get to that developmental stage where they can't do it themselves, but they're close, that's when you start showing them. So let's take tying your shoes, for example. Of course, there's a period of time you can't tie your shoes. You don't have the fine motor coordination, et cetera, et cetera. You tie the shoes for them, of course. Then they start to get to a point where you could tell they have an interest and or they seem like they could start trying. And that's when you start to mentor them and you show them. You're like, okay, so you sing a little song, you show them how to do the loops, little bunny ears, and and they try and they can't, and they get frustrated and they cry, and you're like, it's all right, sweetheart, it'll come, it'll come. And we try again and again, it's no problem. So you show them how to do it. So first you do it for them, then you show them how to do it, right? And then once they are able to do it, you watch them do it. So you're still there, you're next to them, but you're separate from them at that point, and you're watching. So you watch your child go in and ask for help. You don't call the teacher, you don't, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, you walk away and you let them do it on their own. Does that mean they're going to tie their shoe perfectly every time? No. Does it mean sometimes they're going to forget how to tie their shoes? Yeah, sometimes they will. Because the way that we learn is rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And for over childhood, that rinse and repeat is critically important to learning what we need to learn to be adults in this world and to make good decisions for ourselves. So you want to make sure that you're providing your children by letting go and going through that process of mentoring. You're providing your children with the opportunity to try and try and try and try until they have a handle on how they have chosen to tie their shoes. Maybe you show them one way and they figure out another way to do it for themselves, and then that's it. That's beautiful too. Same thing with how they manage their studies or how they manage a crisis in a relationship, a breakup, for example, how they handle an argument with you, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So honest, honesty, respect, collaboration, family cohesiveness. Okay. So create a structure and a form of communication within your family that allows for that. Positive communication and collaboration. So reinforce what your children do right much more than what they don't do right. So we have a tendency, and I hear this from my teens, they'll say, they're always telling me what I'm not doing. They don't even notice what I am doing right. They're just always telling me how I get things wrong. And it feels like they don't think I'm capable. They don't trust me. And I'm never good enough. It's always something else that I've got to get better at, that I'm not doing well enough. So it's easy for us to forget to reinforce the positive things much more than the negative. And that can become challenging at different times of development when there feels like there's more negative going on than the positive. So you've got to look for these really small increments of change in your children, because change is not going to come in big leaps. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, they're all set. Oh my God, thank God I don't ever have to have the conversation with them again. No, it's not going to happen like that. It's going to be one step ahead, two steps back, two steps ahead, three steps back, four steps ahead, two steps back. That's how it's going to go. So when they take those steps ahead, even if they're really tiny, you want to make sure that you reinforce those. And you want to reinforce them not necessarily with praise. Sometimes you can, but you don't want that to be your go to. So here is praise. Praise is, oh my gosh, you are an amazing cake maker. That's praise. It's like, okay, I don't even know what that is, an amazing cake maker. And you're talking to a 10-year-old that made a cake. You're labeling them as an amazing cake maker. You're praising them. So you're saying, you are a good cake maker. That actually creates stress for your children because then they feel like the next time they make a cake, if they don't get that feedback, the cake isn't good enough, they're not good enough, and they're not worthy. And I hear that from the kids too. Like the kids are really smart and they're identified as being really smart really young, and they're told they're really smart. And oh my God, you're so smart, and you're the smartest kid, and you're so good at this and good at that, and oh my God, you're amazing. This is all praise. These kids get all jumbled up. They're like, oh my God, a lot of them end up with anxiety disorders. They end up stepping back and pretending not to care because the pressure is too much for them to perform to that level of praise all the time. And we have our kids in a culture of praise. Again, puts them at risk for making decisions that aren't healthy for them because it doesn't feel good. So, what kind of feedback do you want to give your kids? You want it to sound, let me give you an example. Let's say you come home from work and you need some help in the kitchen. And so you say to your child, hey, could you set the table for me? And they're like, yeah, sure. And they set the table. And then you praise them. You say, oh my God, you're an amazing table setter. I've never seen a table set so nice than that table. And I'm going to ask you every time to set the table because you're the best one in the family. You did everything just right, just perfectly. The forks, the kid's like, oh my God, I never want to set the table again. Now, thoughtful feedback, meaningful feedback sounds like this. They set the table. You turn around and you say, wow, thank you so much for setting the table for me. I had a really tough day at work today, and you just did something that I now don't have to do. And I really appreciate that because you're making my evening easier. That is meaningful feedback that builds independence, a sense of self, a sense of worthiness. That child is going to puff up. They're going to feel like, oh my gosh, I did something of value in my parents' life. I made a difference. And what will likely happen with that child, if they get that kind of feedback from you, that form of feedback around things they do right, they'll do more right things and they'll do them without you having to tell them. So now all of a sudden they see you walk in a month later and you're dragging yourself in the door. You had a rough day and you say, "Oh my God, oh, I got to make dinner. Okay, let's go." And you turn around and the table's set. And that's because that child realizes I can make a difference in in my parents' life. I'm of value. And when you feel as a human being of value, you are more likely to make decisions that are good for you, that are self-respecting, that are safe, because you're creating this sense of worthiness that you don't want. It's like a golden egg. Why would you go out and binge drink? It's like, I'll go out and have a few drinks. Yeah, okay, but I'm not binge drinking. Why would I do that? Because then I'm putting this golden egg at risk. And I respect it. I love it. I think it's pretty cool. And I want to protect it. So let's stop there. I could talk all night about this.